Hear now these words from the Gospel of John. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of God who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. So for the second time, the Pharisees asked the man who had been born blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen." Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The opening lines of this week's story reveal the mindset of Jesus' day. He saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It's not unlike the mindset that was rampant in Job's day, or the mindset that trapped the Samaritan woman at the well. If there's something wrong with you, as the mindset says, or wrong from the perspective of others, then you must have done something to deserve it. But Jesus squashes that mindset quickly. Neither this man or his parents sinned. Just like that. Jesus says that there isn't some system that God has devised that rewards the good and punishes the evil. But in the absence of a nice, neat system, what remains is randomness, chaos, some people would call it. And some people are very uncomfortable with chaos. Chaos isn't predictable. Chaos is fuzzy. Uncomfortable with chaos, as with questions without answers, there are those who would prefer to create a system where there is absolute cause and effect. In many ways, such a system makes more sense. Do this, the result is that. Do good, and good is returned to you. Do bad, and bad is returned to you. Of course, that type of system, at least relative to human behavior, creates a kind of predictability that might not be preferred in the overall. Think about it. If good is rewarded and evil is punished, we'd be fools to do anything but good. But then how would we know someone who was truly good? Those who do good for the sake of goodness and rightness, rather than for a right reward. Personally, those whom I admire the most are people who act selflessly, who do random acts of kindness for no other reason than that they know that they are doing the right thing. There are, of course, people in this world who think it's foolish to act rightly unless there's a reward. The Pharisees of Jesus' day were people like that. It made no sense to them to think that anyone would heal a blind person. a poor blind person, no less. What's the reward in that? Failing to understand that doing good for the sake of goodness' sake has its own rewards. All of the Pharisees can understand that there was a violation of the Sabbath that had occurred. Have you ever known anyone like that? Goodness is all around them, and all they notice is something bad or wrong. I've met people like this, and it causes me to wonder, have they lived all their lives without recognition of the good and beautiful? Or is it that darkness has so permeated their lives that light has been eradicated? While I may never know why they behave as they do, I'm saddened for them. They seem incapable of seeing all the goodness around them. None of this is to say that there is only goodness and that there is no connection between sin and suffering. There are times when we know only too well that there is a connection. Our lives are interconnected, and our behavior affects those to whom we're connected. When I sin, I hurt others, my children, my friends, my neighbors, and maybe even you, the members of this church. Our actions do matter. Crack babies are an extreme example, but they certainly demonstrate how sin and suffering can be interconnected. But not always, and not in today's story. Jesus says that sin is not the cause of this man's infirmity. The disciples thought that it was, but they were mistaken, misled by a mindset that they had adopted from their culture. Today, we would call it a paradigm. The same mindset exists in today's culture, at least for a great many people. How often do we see and judge? Someone has lost their job. They must be lazy. Someone has a menial job. It means he has no education or intelligence. Someone is homeless. They must be a drug or an alcohol addiction. We are often quick to make value judgments, and by doing that, we miss out of the potential of discovering new possibilities. I remember working in a church when I was in seminary. A Russian immigrant worked at the church as a janitor. One day I had a chance to speak with him, and I asked him what it was that he had done in Russia. "I make violins," was his reply. With amazement, I asked him to share his story. And as he did, I learned that this man made violins and cellos and had won international awards. He was presently making a cello for someone in the Philharmonic. Who would have ever guessed? Opportunities are often missed when we make judgments based on what we think we see. How different then is our attitude from that of the disciples who wanted to know who had sinned, or that of the Pharisees who can't possibly believe that a miracle happened on the Sabbath? How often is our mind closed to the possibility of something we can't begin to imagine? The Pharisees' minds were undoubtedly closed, and the setting for today's story may offer us some clues as to why. Jesus had gone to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles, and he was still there. During the festival, large candelabras were lit in the temple courts, and because of the temple's higher elevation, the light was visible throughout the city, and the light was thought to symbolize the revelation and truth of the Jewish faith. Another part of the festival involved the priests pouring water from the pool of Siloam onto the temple steps so that it would flow down and out into the world outside, and so indicate that the Jewish faith would satisfy the world. Both of these activities are part of a system, in this case, a religious system that thinks it possesses all that's necessary to be known. It's not unlike some religious systems of today that think that they possess all the truth or only the only path. The God of such a system, by the very nature of a closed system, must be a non-participatory God, a God incapable of newness. This story appears to be a direct refutation of such systems, such activities, and such a God. Jesus not only reveals himself to be a new light, but he uses the very same pool of water, not simply as a symbol, but as a place of new beginnings. By using the very symbols of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus is saying that light and hope are more than mere symbols. They're activities present in our everyday lives. We cannot forget that John wrote his gospel to a community that was suffering persecution because they were following Jesus rather than a prescribed set of rules and regulations. They were trying to demonstrate their faith with their lives, not just with religious symbolism. They were doing good for goodness sakes, and they were suffering for it, just as Jesus had. And so this story provides a statement about why goodness runs into hostility and trouble, and why ministry can elicit the deepest kind of hostility in other people. It has to do with envy. Envy is the secret sin, the unmentionable sin, the sin no one ever wants to identify or talk about, precisely because it is present in most of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. It is one of the most powerful and perversive proclivities within the human personality, right after our need for food and sex. It is the underlying reason why things go terribly, horribly wrong. It is why good people often end up being punished for who and what they are. It is one of the primary reasons Jesus was crucified, because he was precisely what his enemies wanted to be, and they resented that they were not. He was a profoundly good man, sent from God, with the power to heal and restore all who simply needed to be made new again. Jesus was simply too popular, too successful, too brilliant, too good. People admired Jesus. They were transfixed by his stories, were spellbound by his charisma, and overwhelmed by the generosity of his message and ministry. And that's why he was destroyed. Because as long as we permit someone like that to exist, he remains an annoying, frightening, even damning reminder of all we have chosen not to be ourselves. No doubt some people are afraid that if they discard what they've always known, all they'll be left with is a lack of clarity. In today's world, the fastest growing churches are those with a black and white mentality. Gray, that fuzzy state of not having an answer, isn't something that they can live with. They're more afraid of fuzziness than they are afraid of believing the wrong things. I think the newly sighted man's parents were somewhat like that. They should have been ecstatic. They should have been filled with jubilation. They should have been hugging their son and dancing in the street. Instead, they were terrified, afraid that if they acknowledged their son's cure, they might be dismissed from the synagogue. And dismissal would mean not only separation from God, but being ostracized by the community. Of course, we're never separated from God, no matter what. But sadly, some people believe that when bad things happen, God makes them happen. And when there's no solution to a problem, it means that God isn't listening. I can't imagine what it might have been like for this man's parents to have been told that they or their son had done something so wrong that he was born blind. Not only were they ignorant of the truth, but they had passed this mindset onto their son, who had absorbed it only too well. He said, "We know that God does not listen to sinners." Except that God does listen to sinners. Except that God must have listened to this Jesus, for the newly sighted man knows that sightedness didn't simply happen. So either Jesus is not a sinner, or God listens to sinners, maybe even both. Unfortunately, the Pharisees aren't open to either option, and so all that they can do is drive this man from their midst, angered at the possibility that Jesus was trying to teach them, which of course he was, except they refused to learn, to see. And so it becomes clear that those who see more than others see are a risk to those who think they see all there is to see. The more established, secure, and comfortable the religious community, the more adverse it is to visionaries. Let us hope and pray that all of us remain open to new possibilities, to new visions, for there is much that God has yet to show us. Amen.